So, which is a minority language in the Baltic states as a result of these Soviet policies? And I'll give you one quotation that is by Skutnab Kangas, the well-known Finnish linguist who I think many of you know. And she argued that Russian is thus a majorized minority language. This is sometimes hard to follow. Russian is thus a majorized minority language in terms of numbers, but with the powers of majority language, whereas the Baltic languages are minorized majority languages in need of protection usually necessary for the threatened minority languages. And it also gives a basis in the Baltic states for anyone believing that they are an oppressed minority. And this one-upmanship of I'm more oppressed than you are and you're oppressing me and so on has been a game, and a very serious game in the Baltic states. But I think Skutnab Kangas captures this well, that Russians were not the majority population, but their language had the power of the majority language. This has long-term sort of consequences. The period, you remember this period, these were days we could not remember Annus Mirabilis of 1989, when the whole of Eastern Europe changed and the Berlin Wall fell, this period of Gorbachev's glasnost, perestroika, growing national reassertion. Gorbachev did not expect glasnost to result in strong national feelings, but that's exactly what happened. You had in the Baltic states, as elsewhere in the non-Russian republics of the Soviet Union, revival of all the national symbols, flags, anthems, significant calendar days. Everyone knows the words of the national anthem, even though it's been, in the case of Latvia, forbidden for 50 years. How can it happen? Little kids knew the national anthem. How did they learn it? How did it happen? They did. There was growing political resistance. We had, for example, the Baltic Way demonstration, which was a huge demonstration stretching all the way from Vilnius to Riga to Tallinn on the 50th anniversary of the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact. And then we had the violence in Vilnius and Riga and barricades of January 1991, when the Soviet Union was wobbling, trying to reassert its power. What would happen? This was the Baltic Way. Stretching across the three Baltic states, a Lithuanian section. And this is interesting, the old people here, the two old people you see at the front here, would have remembered an independent Baltic state. I think this is Lithuania, an independent Lithuania before the Second World War. Everyone else in this picture grew up only knowing the Soviet Union. And yet there they were actually demonstrating against it. How does that happen? In 91, it became serious. The attacks on Vilnius from Soviet tanks, killings in Riga as well, and a period of barricades where all the major social institutions were barricaded, fearing Soviet attacks. Again, just as the Baltic states became independent in the confusion at the end of World War I, this confusion in the Soviet Union in 1991, the putsch in Moscow and so on, gave the Baltic states the red light. We were going to be independent, and they all declared their independence in August 1991. Most people here would remember that time. Even while still in the Soviet Union, the Baltic states started to introduce their own language laws. And this was in the Supreme Soviets, as they were called. The Supreme Soviets were democratically elected parliaments, and the ones in this period actually really did become quite independent and quite democratic. They reasserted the status of the Estonian and Latvian as a national language, as they were called republican languages, as they were republics of the Soviet Union. They stipulated that all government, administrative, and all people having contact with the public must have some competence in Estonian or Latvian, and they put on a time limit, stipulated that you must know this. Generally, the time limit was 3 years, that within 3 years all public officials, but also all people serving the community would need to establish a level of proficiency in Estonian and Latvian. Russian was given a transitional status, other languages as well, but really this was a preparation for what was to come. But we also found the first resistance then. Organisations known as the Interfront, generally Russian imperialist organisations that wanted to maintain the Soviet Union, that argued against the independence moves, that started also to accuse the national movements of being not only nationalist but also anti-Russian, and this became a very, this continued after independence. August 1991, we have the reassertion of the independence and amending of... are they preparing dinner or what? Amending the language laws where the transitional status was ended. Estonian and Latvian became the sole state languages. And this is very deliberate. The Baltic states did not see themselves as being sort of double communities on the model of Belgium or something like this. They reasserted one official language. Russian was declared as a foreign language. This was the Baltic way. Significantly, Lithuania did exactly the same. Significantly, most of all the non-Russian republics of the Soviet Union have implemented similar language policies, though some have given more status to Russian than others. We had hundreds of thousands of workers who were in public contact positions. They were professionals, they were shopkeepers, they were whatever, they were cashiers, they were accountants, whoever they were, they had contact with the public. They were then asked if you had not attended Estonian or Latvian education, you were asked to sit for language attestation tests, which would attest your knowledge of language at the relevant level, so that for doctors and for professionals it was at the highest level, for caretakers and so on it was at the lower level. There were various language proficiency levels set, and these attestations have been quite massive, and they continued all the way through the 1990s and even continue today. Over 500,000 people have passed these language attestation tests in Latvia, and about 300,000 in Estonia. So we have quite a large this large program of needing to prove your language. And then the issue of citizenship. Of all the republics of the Soviet Union, Estonia and Latvia were the only two that did not automatically grant citizenship to all legitimate residents of the countries. Lithuania did. Lithuania, with a very small, relatively small proportion of settlers, said all can be citizens, and they just believed in the strength of the Lithuanian state and Lithuanian society to cope with that issue. But in Estonia and Latvia, where you had such a huge proportion of people who were recent settlers, and such a small proportion of them knowing the languages, it was decided that this would be too difficult. There would be basically a constitutional standoff if all the people were made citizens, and it was decided that citizenship would be restricted to all of those of whatever nationality, but all of those who were citizens in 1940 or their descendants. So it didn't matter if you were German or Jewish or Estonian or Russian or whatever. If you or your parents, grandparents had been citizens of those countries between the two world wars, you could claim citizenship of these countries again. And the Soviet settlers, if they desired citizenship, would need to pass a naturalization test, which is largely a language test, also a little bit of knowledge of the history and constitution of the country. Those citizenship tests are quite common throughout the world. There's nothing unusual. but in the Baltic states, this led to massive opposition from Russia. Reactions. Russia began its offensive on human rights restrictions, on language and citizenship, arguing that Russian should be a second official language of the Baltic states, and arguing that all people should become citizens of the Baltic states. This has gone right down to the present day. It's still the argument from Moscow. It's still what we hear. International institutions were quite wary in the early 1990s. There were endless delegations coming to see if Estonians were bashing Russians in the streets, finding no such phenomena taking place. The international institutions all made very good sounding recommendations that people should be nice to Russians, but basically were a bit perplexed by what really they should recommend. Very quickly there was growing use of Estonian, Latvian. Those of you who remember the Soviet Union remember the slogans over all the buildings, and they passed for advertisements. Support the proletarian struggle, produce better Soviet goods. All these things, they were changed. The shop signs were changed. You'll find now very few Cyrillic signs anywhere in the Baltic states. The visual impact has completely changed. Now you can see those beautiful buildings without the slogans in Riga, Tallinn and elsewhere. As I mentioned before, hundreds of thousands of people sat those language attestation tests, and this has improved the level of language. The language laws in particular, as I mentioned, Latvian, Estonian, sole language of government, public administration. Though Russian is often used informally, you'll get correspondence in the state language, though officials will always use Russian if someone doesn't know the state language. In higher education, that has become Latvian and Estonian from around the middle end of the 1990s. So all higher education now is in the state language. The nature of the language laws, as I mentioned, that all those at positions of public contact, whether in the public sphere or the private sphere, must have the capacity to use Estonian or Latvian, respectively. And an important point here, it's not that language use is monitored. We don't have people in the Baltic states walking around listening whether this official or this shopkeeper is talking Russian or Latvian or Estonian to someone. But we want what the laws stipulate is that those workers in public contact positions must have the capacity to actually be able to serve somebody in the state language. This was the basis also of the attestation tests, of course. The international dimensions, continuing political pressure from Russia right down to the present day through such organisations, the Organisation the OECD, also the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe, Council of Europe. Everyone has had an interest. United Nations, I won't count them all. They've all sent delegations. They've all said that there are no gross violations of human rights. They've all said that people should be nicer to the Russians. There have been European concerns over the citizenship laws, and there have been European pressures, some successful, to change some of this, and also over the language requirements, particularly in the private economic sphere, while demanding certain language capacity in the public sphere and in government organisations is understood and is not controversial. To have this in the private economic sphere is considered an infringement of private economic rights, and therefore there has been some conflict with international organisations over that. And also in the case of Latvia, whether publicly elected persons must have language capacity as well. The